Last night, I had to work late at my office in the big city. It was well past midnight when I finally decided to call it a night. Exhausted, I called for an Uber to take me home. The streets were eerily quiet, a stark contrast to their usual bustling state. I stood under a flickering streetlight, feeling a chill despite the warm summer night. My phone buzzed, showing my ride was only a couple of minutes away. I glanced around, noticing a few shadowy figures moving in the distance. Then a car pulled up. It was a beat-up sedan, not the sleek black car the app had shown. But I was tired and just wanted to get home. The driver rolled down the window, and I saw a man with greasy hair and a strange, unsettling smile. "You call for an Uber?" he asked. My gut told me something was off. The car, the driver's appearance, nothing matched the profile on my app. I took a step back, trying to see the license plate, but it was too dark. The man noticed my hesitation and his smile widened, revealing crooked teeth. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm just filling in for a friend. He got caught up in something. Come on, get in." I took another step back. "I'll wait for my actual ride, thanks," I said, trying to sound confident. His smile faded. "Suit yourself," he muttered before driving off, tires screeching as he rounded the corner. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. A minute later, my real Uber arrived, matching the description perfectly. I climbed in, still shaken, and told the driver about the encounter. He just nodded, saying the city was full of weirdos, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a random creep. The next day, I couldn't get the incident out of my head. I decided to check the local news, half expecting to find nothing. But there it was, in bold letters: "Suspected serial killer apprehended after attempted abduction." My heart sank as I read the details. The police had arrested a man driving a beat-up sedan. He had a history of posing as a rideshare driver to lure unsuspecting victims. My blood ran cold. It was him. The man who had tried to pick me up was the same one now in custody. The article mentioned he had been operating in the area for months, with several disappearances linked to him. I sat back, heart pounding, realizing just how close I'd come to becoming one of those missing persons. The city, with all its lights and noise, suddenly felt a lot darker and more dangerous. I couldn't shake the image of that man's smile, knowing how narrowly I had escaped a fate too horrifying to imagine. My boyfriend Mark and I were exhausted after our late-night flight. We had just landed in our hometown after a long vacation, and all we wanted was to get home and crash. The airport was nearly deserted, the occasional echo of footsteps and distant announcements, the only sounds breaking the silence. We ordered an Uber and stood outside, shivering in the chilly night air. A few minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up. The driver, a well-dressed man in a suit, stepped out and smiled warmly at us. "Are you Mark and Emily?" he asked, confirming our names. We nodded, relieved to be on our way. He took our bags and placed them in the trunk, then held the door open for us. I remember thinking how polite he was, a stark contrast to the typical hurried drivers we usually encountered. As we settled into the back seat, the driver made small talk, asking about our trip and where we were from. At first everything seemed fine, but soon I started to notice little things that made me uneasy. He missed the exit for our neighborhood, claiming he knew a shortcut. Then he started taking weird, unfamiliar turns, and his pleasant demeanor began to feel forced, almost too eager. Mark noticed it too. He exchanged a worried glance. I could tell he was getting anxious. I pulled out my phone to check our route on the Uber app, only to see a notification that sent a chill down my spine. "Your Uber has arrived, waiting at pickup." My heart skipped a beat. I showed the message to Mark, and we both realized what was happening. This man wasn't our driver. We were in the car with a stranger, someone who had tricked us into believing he was our Uber. "Excuse me, but I think you missed the turn again," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. The driver didn't respond, just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road with a strange intensity. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. We had to get out of there. At the next stoplight, Mark leaned over and whispered, "We need to run, now." The car came to a halt, and without hesitating, we bolted out of the back seat, leaving our bags behind. The driver shouted something, but we didn't look back. We sprinted towards a gas station we had spotted a few blocks back, our hearts pounding, adrenaline fueling our every step. We burst into the gas station, breathless and terrified. The clerk looked at us with wide eyes as we frantically explained what had happened. He quickly locked the doors and called the police. We waited there, shaking and clutching each other until the authorities arrived. The police took our statements and reassured us we were safe. They promised to investigate, but at that moment, all I cared about was that we were out of that car and alive. We eventually got a ride home from a friend, still shaken but grateful to be okay. Days turned into weeks, and we heard nothing from the police. Our bags, which had all our vacation memories, were never recovered. I scoured the news for any updates, but there was nothing. The man who had taken us was still out there, free to continue his twisted game. I couldn't believe how close we had come to becoming his next victims. The thought of him still out there, targeting others, kept me up at night. It was a chilling reminder of how easily our trust can be exploited and how dangerous it can be to let our guard down, even for a moment. Now, every time we take a rideshare, we double-check everything. The car, the driver, the license plate. We never want to experience that kind of terror again. It's a night we'll never forget, a story we'll always share, hoping it will keep others safe from the same nightmare. But in the back of our minds, we know that somewhere out there, he's still lurking, waiting for his next unsuspecting victims. I had stayed out way too late at the bar, catching up with some old friends. By the time I decided to call it a night, it was well past 2 a.m. I called for an Uber to take me home, grateful for the convenience in my slightly tipsy state. A car arrived a few minutes later, and I climbed in, barely glancing at the driver, just happy to be heading home. The driver, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, confirmed my address and started driving. At first, everything seemed normal. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engine and the movement of the car lull me into a light doze. I opened my eyes and realized we were no longer in the familiar city streets. Instead, we were on a narrow, winding road surrounded by dense woods. I checked my phone for the route, but the signal was weak and the map was struggling to load. A sense of unease started to creep in. "Is this the right way?" I asked, trying to mask the anxiety in my voice. "Just a shortcut," the driver replied with a reassuring smile. "We'll be back on the main road soon." The woods grew thicker, the trees looming on either side, their branches casting eerie shadows under the pale moonlight. The road was deserted with no other cars in sight. I started to regret not paying more attention when I got into the car. Suddenly, the car slowed down. Up ahead, there was a roadblock, a couple of large branches, and a sign that looked hastily made, warning of construction. The driver stopped the car, staring at the obstacle with a furrowed brow. "This doesn't look right," he muttered, mostly to himself. He turned to me. "Stay in the car. I'll move the branches." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I felt trapped. The driver stepped out and started to drag the branches away. Just as he cleared one, figures emerged from the woods surrounding the car. They were men, dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by masks. My heart pounded as I fumbled with my seatbelt, trying to unclip it with shaking hands. One of the men punched the driver and threw him to the ground. Another yanked open the passenger door, grabbing my arm with a vice-like grip. "Get out," he growled, pulling me from the car. My mind raced with panic and fear, my senses heightened. I could see the gun in his other hand. "No, please," I begged, trying to pull away, but he was too strong. He pushed me towards the others, who were now forcing the driver to his knees. The men started demanding our wallets, phones, anything that had value. I handed over my belongings, my hands shaking. The driver did the same, his face pale with fear. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, one of the men grabbed me and pressed the weapon to my head. "No witnesses," he hissed. I felt a cold dread wash over me. This was it. I was going to die here, in the middle of nowhere. But then, headlights appeared, growing brighter as another car approached. The men froze, looking towards the light. As the car came closer, I noticed the silhouette of a police cruiser. "Run!" I shouted, taking advantage of the distraction. We bolted towards the approaching car, the sounds of scattering footsteps and shouts behind me. The officer in the car turned on the flashing lights as I reached the car, breathless and terrified. The officer, an older lady with a kind face, got out of her car and asked, "Are you okay?" Her voice filled with concern. I nodded, still shaking, and looked back to see the Uber driver stumbling towards us. We climbed into the back seat, and the officer drove us to the police station. We reported the incident, and the police assured us they would investigate, but I knew those men would likely disappear into the night, never to be found. The next day, as I sat in the safety of my home, the reality of how close I'd come to death sank in. I couldn't shake the feel of that cold barrel resting on my forehead, the image of those soulless eyes of the man who held it. That night left a mental scar that will never fully heal, a constant reminder of how close I came to disappearing into the darkness forever.